You think you're a good person because you've never been tested by a mountain of stolen gold. But when your father's legacy turns out to be a crime scene, and the only way to save your family is to keep the loot, doing the right thing starts to look a lot like suicide. The hospital room smelled of sterile rot and expensive flowers, a clinical purgatory where my father lay motionless. I stared at the leather-bound ledger found in his safe, the ink bleeding secrets of decades spent draining the bank accounts of the desperate. Every luxury I'd ever known, my education, this designer coat, our penthouse, was paid for with the lifeblood of families he'd systematically ruined. My mother's hand trembled against the glass window of the intensive care unit, her wedding ring catching the harsh fluorescent light. If we admit where this money came from, the lawsuits will strip us to the bone before your father is even cold, she hissed, her voice a jagged blade. I looked at the ledger, then at her terrified eyes, and realized that my morality had a very specific, very high price tag. By the next morning, I was sitting in the mahogany-drenched office of our family attorney, my face a mask of cold porcelain indifference. I authorized the transfer of the primary offshore accounts into a charitable foundation designed to look like a tribute to my father's supposed generosity. It wasn't about being a saint. It was about laundering our survival under the guise of a grieving daughter's devotion. I spent the afternoon at a high-end gala, sipping champagne that tasted like copper and gilt, while strangers praised my father's visionary spirit. Every compliment felt like a slap, a reminder that the world loves a lie as long as it's wrapped in silk and prestige. I smiled back, practicing the hollow stare of someone who has already traded their soul for a comfortable seat at the table. Later that night, the silence of my apartment was broken by the sound of a ticking clock that felt like a heartbeat. I opened the ledger again, highlighting the first name on the list of victims. A small construction firm driven to bankruptcy in 2014. I wrote a cashier's check for $50,000, labeling it an anonymous grant, knowing it was a drop of water in an ocean of debt. Julian came home late, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his own struggling architectural firm. He kissed my forehead, unaware that the woman he loved was currently sitting on the wealth that had once belonged to his own parents. I watched him in the shadows of the hallway, the high-contrast moonlight making him look like a ghost of the life my father had stolen. "You're working too hard, Julian," I whispered, my voice sounding defensive even to my own ears. He laughed bitterly, tossing his keys onto the marble counter with a sharp metallic ring that made me flinch. "Some of us didn't inherit a safety net, Elena. We have to fight for every inch against people who play dirty," he said, his eyes burning with a resentment I finally understood. In a warm, gentle, and heartfelt storytelling tone, I retreated to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face until my skin went numb under the stark vanity lights. The mirror showed a stranger, someone who was secretly hunting her husband's past while funding his present with blood money. I had become the very thing Julian hated, a silent predator disguised as his greatest supporter, and the weight of the lie was already starting to crush my chest. The next day, I sat in my car outside a dilapidated suburban house, watching an elderly woman struggle with a foreclosure sign. She was number 4 on the list, a widow whose life savings had been funneled into my father's vacation home in Aspen. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, the engine idling like a low, persistent growl in the rainy street. I mailed the envelope from a post office 3 towns over, wearing sunglasses and a nondescript hoodie to avoid the cameras. This was my new reality, a cycle of theft and silent restitution, playing God with money that never belonged to me. I wasn't seeking forgiveness. I was just trying to balance a scale that was permanently broken, hoping the truth wouldn't find me before I ran out of checks. As I speak, my voice stays warm and gentle, but I read the words exactly as they are written. The Foundation's first public event was a masterpiece of clinical deception, held in a hall filled with people who traded in whispers and influence. I stood on the stage, the high-contrast spotlights blinding me, as I announced a series of empowerment grants for struggling small businesses. It was a calculated performance of redemption, using the stolen interest to buy a public halo, while the principal remained tucked safely in our private accounts. Julian sat in the front row, his expression a mix of pride and a haunting, deep-seated sorrow. I watched him applaud, the sound echoing like dry wood snapping in a cold room. He didn't know that the very scholarship he was praising had been funded by the liquidation of a trust fund my father had embezzled from Julian's own grandfather. Back at the apartment, the tension between us felt like a physical barrier, a wall built of things left unsaid and crimes hidden in plain sight. Julian was hunched over his drafting table, the harsh desk lamp casting long, skeletal shadows across his blueprints. "The bank called today," he said without looking up, his voice brittle and exhausted. "They're freezing our business credit line unless I can show a massive cash infusion by Monday." I walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the rigid knots of stress beneath his shirt. "I can help, Julian. The Foundation has discretionary funds for local architects," I said, the lie sliding out of my mouth with terrifying ease. He spun around, his eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce pride that bordered on a cold indifference. "I don't want your father's charity, Elena. I want to earn my own way without being beholden to that man's shadow." The next morning, I visited my father in the hospital, the steady beep of the heart monitor sounding like a countdown to my own exposure. He looked small, a withered shell of the predator who had taught me that power was the only currency that mattered. I leaned over his bed and whispered into his deaf ear, "I'm giving it back, Dad, but I'm keeping the throne you built." I spent hours in the basement of the city archives, the air thick with the smell of damped paper and old secrets. I was looking for the specific legal maneuvers my father used to bankrupt Julian's family, a trail of scorched earth disguised as bad investments. Every document I uncovered was a new betrayal, a piece of evidence that could end my marriage and my freedom with a single phone call to the authorities. I found a witness, a retired clerk who remembered the clerical errors that had cost Julian's parents their home and their dignity. I met him in a cramped clinical diner where the coffee tasted like ash and the fluorescent lights hummed with a low-frequency dread. "Your father didn't just take their money," the old man wheezed, his eyes narrowing with a sharp, judgmental intensity. "He took their future." And he laughed while he did it. I offered the man a bribe to stay silent, pushing a thick envelope across the Formica tabletop with a hand that didn't shake. He looked at the money, then at me, and I saw his disgust reflected in the window's grimy glass. He took the envelope, but the look he gave me stayed in my gut like a lead weight, a silent confirmation that I was becoming a mirror image of the man in the hospital bed. When I got home, Julian was sitting in the dark, a single laptop screen illuminating his face in a ghostly, digital blue. "I found something strange in my father's old files, Elena," he said, his voice low and dangerous. He pointed to a digital scan of a signature that matched the one on my foundation's latest audit. The paper trail I had been trying to bury was starting to bleed through the surface, and the man I loved was the one holding the shovel. As I stood in the doorway, the hallway light behind me casting a long, imposing shadow that reached all the way to his feet, I felt that choice settle heavy in my chest. I had to choose, confess the truth and lose him, or lean into the villainy and gaslight the only person who still believed in my goodness. "You're seeing ghosts because you're tired, Julian," I said, my voice as cold and sharp as a winter morning. "Don't let your obsession with the past ruin our future." "Stop here." Julian didn't look away, his eyes searching mine for a flicker of the woman he once trusted. But I kept my expression as rigid as a tombstone. He slammed the laptop shut, the sound echoing through the cavernous apartment like a gunshot, signaling the end of our shared peace. "My father died thinking he was a failure, Elena, but it turns out he was just a target for yours," he spat, his voice trembling with a lethal combination of grief and dawning realization. I didn't flinch. I simply turned on the kitchen light, exposing every corner of our expensive, blood-soaked life in a harsh, unforgiving glare. The next day, I made the final move to secure the legacy, transferring the last of the disputed assets into an ironclad offshore trust that Julian could never touch. I told myself it was for his protection, a golden cage to keep him safe from the poverty my father had inflicted on his bloodline. In my mind, I wasn't a thief anymore. I was a curator of consequences, managing the wreckage of two families with the cold precision of a surgeon. I watched the progress bar on the computer screen, each percentage point representing another layer of armor between us and the truth. I returned to the hospital one last time, standing over my father as the machines hummed their rhythmic, mechanical lullaby. I reached down and turned the dial on his medication, a slight adjustment that the nurses wouldn't notice until it was far too late to reverse. It wasn't an act of mercy, but a final business transaction to ensure the secrets in his head died with him. As his breathing slowed, I felt a strange, hollow lightness, as if the weight of the ledger had finally been transferred from my hands to his grave. When the call came an hour later, I didn't cry. I simply put on my blackest veil and began the choreography of a grieving daughter. Julian stood by my side at the funeral, his presence a silent, suffocating accusation as the dirt hit the casket. He knew everything, and I knew that he knew, yet we both stood there in our tailored mourning clothes, bound together by a fortune he hated and a woman he no longer recognized. We were a portrait of success, built on a foundation of bones. Two people trapped in a nightmare of our own making. Weeks later, the first anonymous restitution check arrived in Julian's business account, enough to clear his debts and fund his dreams for a lifetime. I watched him from the doorway of his office as he stared at the numbers on the screen, his face a mask of tortured conflict. He knew exactly where that money came from, and he knew that by spending it, he was becoming an accomplice to the very crime that had destroyed his parents. He looked up at me, the silence between us heavy, with the unspoken agreement that our love was the interest paid on a debt that could never be settled. As I walked to the window, looking out over the city that my father had plundered and that I now helped to save, the lights below flickered like distant stars, beautiful and cold, hiding the millions of small cruelties that kept the world turning. I had saved my family, I had saved Julian, and I had saved myself. But the cost was a heart that had finally gone silent. I realized then that the right choice is often just the one that leaves you with enough power to silence the people who remember the wrong ones. The ledger was gone, burned to ash in the fireplace of a house bought with stolen dreams, leaving no evidence but the life I now led. Julian eventually used the money to build a landmark that bore his name, a monument to a talent that was blossomed in poisoned soil. We still share a bed, we still share a name, and we still share the crushing weight of a secret that ensures we will never truly touch again. Some truths don't set you free. They just build a more expensive prison. If you discovered your entire lifestyle was funded by your parents' crimes against the person you love most, would you burn your world down for the truth? Or keep the money and try to fix the damage in secret? Is Elena a monster for surviving? Or a saint for carrying the guilt alone?